Let's say that our users want to digitally stalk, harass, or abuse someone. How can we use JavaScript to help them do that? There are two main things. First, we can reduce anonymity, collecting lots of identifying information about anyone using our app and requiring all of it to enable use of the app. Then we want to provide only universal privacy settings instead of fine-grained control. This will help abusers locate their targets and enable escalating and harassment and real-world stalking. Secondly, we can treat a successful login as unimpeachable while providing no enhanced login security such as two-factor authentication. Once inside the app, we can treat everything the user does as a state, like the action is performed or it's not, instead of a timeline, like the action was performed at X time on Y day by Z device. And this is going to allow users to be more successful in their abuse by making it impossible to prove. We could do the opposite and try to use the JavaScript that we developed to reduce the potential for cyber abuse. Hi, I'm Garann. I'm a developer advocate at Vonage, and I mainly work on communications APIs, but I also work with an API for two-factor authentication and login verification. I've been writing JavaScript for a long time, and then I got into community stuff, and then a few years after that, I started doing DevRel as my main focus. But the idea for this talk didn't come to me at work. It actually came to me on maternity leave. So I was at home in Glasgow and I got this email. And I was like, oh, here's something nice. My January update. I don't get any updates on anything. So this is pretty exciting. Usually I'm just sitting on the couch with a baby. What have we got here? Let's see. Oh, what's this map? Okay. Maybe there's actually nothing to update me about. It looks like this has something to do with a trip that I took back in June. So this doesn't seem to be right. Let's see. So here we are. Look at that. Berlin. Yep. Countries and regions visited. It's Germany. It's just Germany. Yeah. Berlin and Glasgow. That's data from 6 months ago. Places visited. Hold up. That is not the hotel I stayed in Berlin. What's going on here? So I did some digging. I found that someone had been accessing my Gmail account for months, thanks to Google security logging. I was able to see the device, the locations, the timestamps. I had this big record of all these intrusions, so I went to the police, and I was like, hey, this is illegal in Scotland. Can you go and tell this person that they better knock it off? And they were like, no. The logging didn't go far enough for the police to just hop in their Batmobile and away and put a stop to it. It would have required a criminal trial to do all of that so that law enforcement could act. And so that's what led me here. When Gmail came out, you may remember that it changed what people thought JavaScript was capable of. It was the first huge Ajax app. And all of us here have probably written Ajax apps at this point, and we now just call them web apps. And we're familiar with the way that the work gets done. So an action is taken by the user, a listener tracks it, and then a resource or multiple resources are requested. So in Gmail, famously, for everything that happens in the app, there are probably at least 2 pieces of code that could log it if they choose to do so. So additionally, thanks to my January update, we know that Google accounts, like the one used to access Gmail, have a granular concept of identity, at least at the point of login. So there isn't just one Garann. There's Garann on the phone, there's Garann sitting at her desk, there's Garann who can jump across space and time and be on both edges of Western Europe at once. And it's not clear whether Gmail, the app, makes a distinction between those accounts when it tracks actions taken by a user, but it would be really unusual if it did. Most apps only consider multiple devices and identities at login. We don't tend to track what actions within the app were taken, period. And when we do, we don't usually associate them with a sub-identity. An email provider can't operate anonymously. It has to collect sensitive data, sometimes things that should be kept private at all costs. So I'm here to ask you all, in cases where we can't protect people with anonymity, can we protect them with greater surveillance? Maybe the way this has proliferated has to do with the way we tend to see ourselves and our users, and where we believe that tech abuse happens. Developers take the role of guiding and assisting our users, not making them think, getting out of their way. We're certainly not going to throw up barriers to them doing what they want to do within our application. With their successful login, they've earned those rights. This is the internet, though. Why are we trusting anybody? We're certainly aware that logins can be corrupted. As long as passwords have existed, people have guessed them, people have written them down where other people can see them, and algorithms with nothing better to do have tried infinite permutations of alphanumeric characters until they found them by brute force. But once you're in, right? And who is you anyway? Our users may not be at all who they say they are, and for a lot of things, we don't consider the data sensitive enough to check. I mean, would you worry about someone getting groceries delivered under a false name? What if those grocery orders create a paper trail of infidelity or alcohol dependency? Is it worth protecting then? Of course, that's more cloak and dagger than even someone with malicious intent might be willing to put the effort into. And why would they? We're giving all kinds of information away for free, frankly. We like to collect information about users that isn't necessarily our purpose, and then we try to make things social or collaborative that don't need to be. We bury a request to share your whole contact book in an app install to increase our signups. You can be a perfectly upstanding user of most apps and still set out to do someone harm using only the tools that we've shoved at you. We know that there are bad actors in our systems, and yet we still default to trusting our users, and we also trust ourselves to know what shouldn't be shared and to properly lock it down. When it comes to privacy, we've got this kind of like fantasy picture of noble rebels who need protection from unstoppable forces. And for sure, there are lots of noble rebels on the internet, but maybe not enough that they should be our default privacy model. We have some execution problems too. Like you can take Twitter, for example. Privacy is dealt with by making an account private, but that only makes the tweets private. The user's photo and their name are still visitable. It's kind of haphazard or arbitrary. It says, this data at the core of our service is very sensitive and must never fall into the wrong hands. But this arguably more identifying data is fine for the whole world to see. The problem with the noble rebels model is that we have very unlikely prey for very unstoppable predators. And that can make it feel like our good intentions are enough, like we can't actually do anything about the problem, so as long as our heart's in the right place, fine. The numbers of people experiencing online harassment, stalking, and other tech abuse are staggering, though. Since these things are still legal gray areas in so many places, it's hard to find exact numbers. But numbers of victims of other crimes who've also experienced tech abuse range from 70% to 99%. And there will be more people for whom there were no other crimes. Or most frighteningly, more people for whom there were no other crimes yet. To really model cyber abuse with the tools we build, we should probably talk about what it is. It's a huge class of harmful behaviors that range from creepy to terrifying. It involves technologies we build, but also smart home devices, computer hardware, and straight-up spy equipment like bugs and drones. It almost always involves collecting information about someone that the abuser shouldn't have, like their communications, their habits and patterns, their relationships, the things they do when they believe they're safe. It can also be more intrusive, though, like messing with people's money or conversations with others. It can be active gaslighting or isolation. It can be stealing images for revenge porn or to try and damage a person's reputation. It can be GPS tracking or even following people with drones. To what end? To damage a person's image, to scare them into doing or not doing something, to find a justification for harming them. The relationship between the target and the abuser can be romantic, familial, one way, like with a stalker, or they can be complete strangers. When we offer those abusers the default privacy we adopted thanks to our noble rebel model, we help them continue and escalate their abuse. One of the things about tech abuse is abusers will use literally anything with an electronic pulse to help them abuse their targets. It's not like spam or something. It's not opportunistic. So when we build in privacy features, we should assume there will be some people who will look at them and instead of being deterred by them, are going to use them to obscure their identities and actions so that they can do something really bad. Most of the choices we might make about how to build privacy features are complex. We take privacy away from one group to provide safety to another. So we have to think about how we can provide the maximum of both to each, but also about what our specific tool does and how it is likely to be abused. Not if, how. So let's go through some examples of what some of the trade-offs are. Letting people hide their location probably seems like a really good way of keeping them safe because then they don't have like stalkers who can figure out where they are and come and stalk them. But it also gives us one less way that we can flag imposters and other bad actors in our systems. There's also the difficulty that in order to use GPS and figure out people's exact location, we have to be permitted to do that. And so if you give people a way to opt out for privacy reasons, then you are inevitably going to get people opting out who are opting out in order to do abusive things. Fortunately, there's a sort of easy way around that, which is to deny that there is a privacy problem with tracking people's GPS. And that's complicated to do, but if you do feel that you're faithfully locking down that data, it should be possible and perhaps easier to get people to allow you to access GPS, but never show that within the app and only use it for purposes of matching up against the location where they say that they are, and figuring out if potentially they are imposters who are misrepresenting themselves in your application. The irony of photos in applications is that the problem that they present, which is that people might take them and use them for things like catfishing, is also the same thing that having them there prevents, which is via things like photo verification, where you can make sure that the person behind the keyboard matches up with the photos that they have submitted of themselves, and then hopefully the community will flag when the photo they submitted does not match up with the identity that they're representing within the app. In terms of going back to the original problem of photo abuse, there's a few things you can do about it. It's slightly limited, just because if obviously you want to display a photo, then you're sending the photo to the device that's accessing it. But you may be able to control who can download them, potentially do things like Snapchat has done to try and control screenshotting and things like that. And of course, you can allow people to preemptively block people that they know are a problem for them, not by uploading their entire contacts list, but by giving you an email address or a phone number and specifically locking that person out of viewing their content. It's totally possible to have users in an app who don't have a username, don't even necessarily have an email address associated with their account, and are just accessing the application via an app download on their device or via a cookie that was set, and that's the only thing that the application knows about them. And that kind of anonymity can be really safe for members of some groups and might actually be really good, but it really depends on the application, because for a lot of applications, I would say maybe even most applications, the bigger problem is going to be that people can come in and easily abuse that. And then you're going to have absolutely no way of saying this individual did this. You're not going to have an email address that you can ban. You may not even have an IP address if you're taking anonymity really seriously. And so you've basically created a tool for people to go in and do whatever kind of abuse your platform enables. And again, it's the very rare pattern or platform that doesn't enable some sort of abuse. The final example is one that makes just absolutely no sense, which is providing an application history of things that happen within the application, but then making that editable. And I believe that this is done so that people can remove anything that might be dangerous or incriminating if someone who's a bad actor saw it. And on the surface, that sounds like that's a cool idea, but just like at first blush, like it makes the data untrustable at that point. Like you don't actually know what happened within the application if you wanted to find out, and it allows anybody who had unauthorized access to then go and make it look like they never did. But the real problem is that it assumes that people who are going to try and harm our users need some sort of justification, and that if they can't find a justification when they're maliciously viewing their application history, then they're just going to walk away. And that seems completely unrealistic to me, that somebody who's out to hurt somebody needs some kind of permission, that perhaps like a hole in their record won't be justification enough when they've removed something that would have been definitely dangerous. If somebody like that has got access to this editable history in the first place, it's already too late. So making it editable is completely beside the point. And of course, there's the fact that like if it got logged, like it probably exists somewhere else. Like it probably hasn't just gone away. Like at minimum an advertiser has it or something like that. At this point, you might have a strong sense of not my job, man. But look. For a long time, the advice about preventing tech abuse has been consistent. Don't download apps, don't click links, don't take nudes unless you want someone to one day use them to ruin your life. And that hasn't stopped cyber abuse. We should all be more than a little concerned that our one solution to the problem is victim blaming. Because that's all that is. It's the same as telling victims of assault, well, you shouldn't have worn that skirt or you shouldn't have walked down that dark alley. Besides being a horrible way to treat people, victim blaming is ineffective. It tells abusers loud and clear that no one with any power to stop the abuse is going to. While it may not necessarily be an incentive, it's about the furthest thing from a deterrent. There's been a lot of movement toward better reporting tools for cyber abuse, but that's simply not enough. Imagine how you'd feel if you were the victim of a crime, any crime, and no one had tried to stop it, but people responsible for the infrastructure where it occurred were like, hey, don't worry, you can talk to us about it, and then we're going to go and we're going to have a really good think about whether we feel like doing something about it. There's a large class of crimes that seem to be just accepted. No one tries to prevent them. We just assume that they will occur. And that emboldens abuse. That same mentality makes it really hard for us as people providing systems to feel empowered to stop the abuse. Why would we change any of our defaults to avoid something we've been told is unavoidable? It's not unavoidable. That's why. All of us here are creating tools for people, and if we take steps to ensure those tools aren't created or used to harm people, and enough of us do that, we can change the assumption that this is going to happen no matter what, and it's basically okay. Maybe the problem is that for too long, we've accepted that the biggest boogeyman in our work is unethical advertisers or something, and it's not. The big boogeyman is people who want to kill people. There are bigger things at stake here than contextual advertising. Web developers don't have to play a passive role in online safety. The code we write can actively help stop abuse, not merely be difficult to use to do more abusing. We're sitting on a ton of data we get for free about users, their behaviors, and the patterns of how the two combine. All of this stuff is stuff we require to make our apps function. We're all aware that we leave this trail across the internet. I think a lot of us probably sleep at night knowing that web developers generally have agreed to avert our eyes. But this is the very same info that can make a difference between gaslighting and someone being believed. It's the difference between the police telling a victim to change their email address and going and serving someone with a restraining order. It's the difference between someone receiving an email like this warning you of a suspicious behavior and someone being killed. Another point in favor of us sticking our noses where they don't belong? It helps combat the widespread mentality that tech abuse and all the toxic garbage it springs from is inevitable and an acceptable cost of doing business. One of the worst harmless things that gets people killed is monitoring, stalking, surveillance, whatever you want to call it. I call it being creepy, but then I'd also be guilty of minimizing it, which happens way too much. We can track this behavior and use that record if we receive a complaint about a user. We can offer atomic privacy controls instead of universal private or not private settings. A huge thing we can do, though, is use access links instead of resource links. So unless you're the owner of a post, image, or other resource, it doesn't exist at any specific URL. Instead, you receive a key to access it, and that key sets your level of permissions, allows you to find it, and is individually expirable by the owner. This is the same idea as OAuth, but at a much more granular scale. It's sort of like sharing Google Docs. You can't just copy the URL of a Google Doc, you have to specifically share it. Or maybe it's like if OAuth and Google Docs had a baby, because really important bit is that once that key is created, you maintain control of it. And you can go and expire individual keys the same way you'd revoke OAuth access. If you're a platform like a social site encouraging people to share lots of personal data, this level of privacy control could let people use your service safely. And if the thought crosses your mind that people don't need to use social sites, consider that one of the main things people achieve through tech abuse is isolation of their targets. Cutting people off from each other is a win for abusers, and this shouldn't be a win-win for the bad guys. Impersonation is another really big problem, whether or not the abuser knows the target in real life. And it's the same whether the abuser gains access to an account created by the target or creates an account specifically to pretend to be them. I mean, of course, the easiest fix is just not to have accounts tied to identities, or to have those identities be meaningful only in the context of your app. But that doesn't work for all scenarios. This is where tracking the things we track anyway, mostly things that involve some sort of routing, is really helpful. We can track what actions were taken by a sub-identity and give users the tools to mitigate the damage an imposter may have done. The sub-identity can be composed of a lot of information, but the problem is that most identifying information we have about our users is suspect. Things like what browser somebody's using can be changed via a drop-down, so it's preferable to define a sub-identity by a token you've given the device, like an app registration or a browser cookie. You couple that sub-identity data with logs that get as specific as email with subject blah 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 opened by device 5 on November 4th, and then you've given targets of abuse the ability to potentially undo harm that's been done by an imposter. GPS unfortunately features heavily in a lot of tech abuse, and that's the obvious stuff like stalkers showing up where someone's going to be, and it's the less obvious stuff like what GPS reveals to an abuser about what someone has been doing. So if you have to do it, you want to do the same kind of safety things that we've talked about generally, but also specifically for GPS, you want to do things like showing more general locations, or perhaps not updating the location immediately, but using some sort of delay if you need people to be in the vicinity immediately in real time. But really, no matter what you do, it's going to be a double-edged sword, where the advantage that you gain in terms of verifying that people are who they are becomes also a liability in terms of other people's safety. And so this is where it becomes useful to involve AI, and this is for not just GPS, but so many other things. We are already doing all kinds of things to ensure people's safety, and there are things that we can do to take that further. Like we can require extra validation to access things that we consider sensitive data, like location history. And if somebody is doing something in an admin panel to remove their location, we can look at whether that seems to be track covering behavior or seems like a normal safety behavior, if we can figure that out. If we see that the screenshot's being taken, we can use that. But mostly what we can do is say that just because somebody's logged in and can see this location information or any other type of information doesn't mean that we trust them, and we still treat them as sketchy. One place AI is really helping us out is with phishing. We're doing a lot better than we used to be with catching spam. But the problem with tech abuse is that it's not just phishing, it's catfishing we have to worry about. And we can still do some things about that, such as photo verification, credit card verification, to make sure that people are who they say they are, and just generally discouraging people from trusting anybody they meet on the internet. But we have to take that same rigor and now apply it to other people who also interact with our users indirectly, not as other users, like advertisers, or even people contributing code or hosting or customer support. We don't typically reassure ourselves that their identities are who they say they are in the same way that we would somebody logging into our system. And so we leave this gaping hole for catfishing via other means within our systems. One place that pushing the responsibility for safety onto targets of abuse seems to have been successful is with stalkerware, and that's really lucky because the things that people do to acquire stalkerware are things like jailbreaking their phone or installing apps that we don't have a lot of control over. And once it's there, it's really hard for us to observe. You can do things like the kind of stuff that Snapchat does, where you're trying to observe whether something is screenshotting the application, or you can do things like just trying to keep sensitive data within an application, but we don't really have a whole lot of control over this. And so it's mostly a matter of taking a proactive stance. The good news is that stalkerware is pretty much really uncommon because it's so difficult to acquire, and so thankfully the fact that we don't have a solution to it is not as big an issue as it would be, say, with impersonation or monitoring. As an industry, we've always valorized getting away with shit. We got a lot of our DNA from the United States Department of Defense, and it shows in our relationship with authority. To stand up here and suggest that we will surveil our users in order to have more information to give to law enforcement seems like really misreading the room. But I think we all know it's gotten out of control. Whether we're talking about anti-vaxxers on Facebook or hate groups on everywhere, the victim blaming the internet has used to absolve itself is something everyone's getting real sick of. Revenge porn isn't the fault of someone who takes nudes any more than being tortured is the fault of someone who complained about a government. If you don't want someone to do something, don't put it on the internet isn't an acceptable answer anymore. The last time security through obscurity worked, we were still using macromedia methods. The internet grew in size and importance, and that wisdom didn't scale. Aggressive privacy and trying to buck accountability for harm that the tools we build enables has not scaled either. In the face of the privacy violations that we stomach to make a few cents per clicks, also the hypocrisy is pretty blinding. Over the worldwide lockdowns, tech abuse skyrocketed. And tech abuse is the warning before something worse happens. In Australia recently, it was estimated that tech abuse was an early feature of abusive dynamics that led to violence or murder in 99% of cases. And this warrants a re-examination of our defaults. There is such a thing as too much privacy after all. Telling people not to walk down dark alleys doesn't work if that's all you build.
And thank you, Garann, and welcome back, everyone. This filter is by popular request from the Seattle event, but unlike a lawyer, I know how to turn it off. So, Garann, this is an important topic. Are there any uniquely JavaScripty ways, though, to raise an alarm about cyber abuse?
I think JavaScript can help a lot in like the front end kind of stuff. So like we can do like kind of heat map kind of stuff. Like we could do something like that. Like we can do things to monitor what people are looking at and like give sort of a like rent-free score, like who's living rent-free in your head, to like people who are like potentially targeting people. Like there's a lot of stuff we could do, but like there's also a lot of like calculus to be done, like how much of that data can we store and like what should we do to trigger that, that I think ties into it. But because we're on the front end, I think we have a unique position in terms of being able to see what people are looking at and what they might be focusing on that is interesting. I thought that I intend to like do a coding project based on Charlie Gerard's talk earlier with the eye tracking, because that's another thing that like could be interesting, and especially from a JavaScript perspective, it's a place where we can actually offer something that that may be really useful.
Okay, and Facebook offers pretty fine-grained privacy. Are they the kind of model you're recommending?
I think Facebook's privacy settings like seem really good because like you can really filter down like who's able to see a post. The one issue I think with that is that you then don't have any way to sort of search the keys that you've given out. Like you can go and look at the individual item or like a post that you've given permissions for, but you don't have any way to like filter like let's say like somebody has like done something that frightened me. Like I can't go and say like on Facebook, what posts can they see? Like what information do they see about me and shut that off? And as far as I know, I don't use Facebook a whole lot. I think the what they have is a really good start, but I think that an admin panel for it is a really crucial piece of that.
All right. Well, thank you so much. This is very important. I'm glad you're taking the time out to speak about it. And next, we are going to hand off to Firas Abukadija talking about open source supply chain attacks. Thank you so much, Garann.